Xander, come on. Okay. All right, and go. All right, so thank you, everyone. We're going to talk about something very near and dear to me, as mentioned, which is redwood trees. I'm kind of in love with them, as you might tell. If you've had the luxury of going to one of our redwood forests, you know how cool they are. It's just like a very alive space, very old, tall trees. There's a lot going on. They just feel very alive. And there's actually a reason for that. These trees are actually incredibly old. Not just the trees that we see, but basically the genome. We actually first see these trees in the fossil record about 240 million years ago. So these are basically dinosaur trees, right? They've existed for a very long time. And when you've been around for that long of a time, your genome actually gets really big. We just recently finished sequencing the California coast redwood genome, and it's actually the second largest genome we've ever sequenced. Humans are basically down here in the middle. Bigger doesn't necessarily mean better, it just means you've been around for a long time, you've adapted to a lot of things, you've collected like a lot of random information, so you could think of them as wise trees. We're used to seeing them here in California, but they've actually existed throughout the entire northern hemisphere. There's still some like variants of the species in Asia that can be found. So yeah, they've been everywhere basically. The thing that we know them the most for now is being tall. And the reason why they're so tall is because they're so old. They grow and they live for so long. And there's actually a reason for that. Basically, with all the information they've collected for living so long, they've basically become this like super tree, like with superpowers that nobody wants to fuck with, basically. Like, you know, fire can't burn the bark, bugs don't like the bark, it's very fibrous, birds don't like it. The sap and the heartwood of the tree has a lot of tannins in it, so it's kind of acidic, so mold doesn't even like it. Which means it loves the California coast, actually, right? Like, it's this awesome wet place where it's not going to rot to death. So it basically took over like this very specific area of the California coast. And while we think of the California coast as being dry, there's actually been really intense droughts, and we see that in the ring history of the trees. So like this most recent drought we went through, that's kind of like nothing, right? There's been like 100-year, 200-300-year droughts, and we can see that in the rings of these trees. So droughts are part of California. If you see these sprouts at the base of the tree, that's actually the tree propagating itself. If it gets stressed, if it thinks it's like dying, it'll basically just start regrowing itself. So if you've ever been in a redwood forest and seen what they call a cathedral, this is actually like basically DNA clones of the same tree that grew up around the other tree that died in the same place. So, and sometimes trees will grow out of old dead trees. It's like super wild. Now, unfortunately, all these awesome properties of this tree is what basically led to the downfall at the hands of humans, because all those awesome properties also makes it an amazing building wood. So the most common thing you see is decks being built out of redwood, because it's a very durable outdoor wood, it's not going to rot, it looks beautiful. You can basically totally neglect it and it's like still going to look pretty good in like 10, 20 years. So you see it a lot in decks, but if you go back just a little bit in time, we used to build entire homes out of this stuff because, you know, you have to admit it looks beautiful, right? So like this is a high-end craftsman home that you would see built in California around the 1940s. You may even live in one of these that's covered under 20 layers of lead paint. There might actually be redwood under there. But if you weren't rich enough to afford a high-end home, there was other things for you. You could get a coffin made out of redwood, or a candy box. Or if you need to store some like acid for batteries, you could also use redwood to store it because the acid wouldn't eat it. So, you know, this is like the typical capitalist dilemma we keep ending up in, where we find something that's like really rare and awesome, and we make it scarce and we put a price tag on it, and we basically mine it into extinction. And that's exactly what we did in California. So these trees that were like 1,000, 2,000 years old, we logged 95% of them in less than 100 years. So, and it got even worse after the 1906 earthquake, because as we all of a sudden had this massive need for a lot of lumber, they also put out building codes saying, hey, redwood doesn't burn, so you need to build out of redwood. So we got busy cutting down the trees like they were going out of style. So if you've actually been lucky enough to be in one of our redwood parks, it's one of these little light green dots. That's all that's left. This dark green is what actually used to exist. So it's a real bummer.
1850s green.
Yeah.
The light is.
So if you see a dumpster like in front of a construction site or a home renovation, just take a peek inside. There's actually a good chance that a lot of this old growth wood is in there. So if you see it, call me. I'll come get it. But also just like use it as a chance to reflect on, reflect on the fact that like the current conversations we're having around sustainability, like that's so important, right? Because it was the lack of those conversations that led to this. So that's it.
My brother and I came across a very tiny redwood forest, and a sign there claimed that it was the only place where California redwoods grew other than California. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so that is one place, and there's a few other places where they're trying to basically propagate the species. This is also like an impressive carbon sink, so they're trying to make sure we don't lose the species.
Why is there such a big discrepancy between what used to be the area of redwood and the current? Is that just logging?
It's all logging. Yeah. Yeah. So the dark green, this is where the forest used to exist, and then the light green is what we have left, basically. And it was all taken away through logging. So.
And the reason why we even have the light green is because there were some wealthy people that loved the redwoods and decided to buy up land. The Save the Redwood organization is what preserved the little pieces that we have left.
So, which species are redwoods? This is not just one tree. There's a few different types.
There's a few different types. Like the ones we have here in California, they're sort of like the most, sort of like how do I say this, the most populous, I guess. There are a few variants of the species that you can find in China and I think in Japan too. Like cedar trees, I think, are actually related if you go back far enough. So yeah, and then yeah, like I was saying to you, we're trying to propagate the species not only in New Zealand, a few places in China, and we're taking what we do have left here and moving it north to give it cooler temperatures, like as the climate warms. So. 2 questions.
So I wanted to kind of build on what Marissa was saying, that so who are kind of the main people involved right now in at least in California, in repropagating and protecting what's already there?
So the repropagation thing is interesting because it's one of these things where it's a bunch of independent people kind of all doing their own thing. That's not super coordinated. But then there's the Save the Redwood League, which funnels a lot of money into research. They were a big part of the genome sequencing. The Sierra Club is obviously involved. So there's a lot of like nonprofits around, sort of like bringing awareness to things and doing research. But then the like propagation thing, that's kind of like a little scattered. And then there are a handful of private landowners who are converting their lands into public parks. There's one opening up somewhere near Sonoma in like a year or two. It's like a few hundred acres of redwood trees that somebody just owned. Now they're gonna let us check it out.
Just a quick comment on that actually, because I think that was done, talking about this landowner, I think that was done with funds purchased actually, right?
Yes.
Right, so what was that? I was curious if you know what that organization was.
I don't remember.
Okay.
Yeah.
But there are organizations doing that kind of like land buyback.
Definitely, yeah. That's happening.
So these trees you said exist like everywhere in the northern hemisphere, but they've probably been there for a long time. How did they sort of get to be everywhere? Was that when the continents were all together and they just sort of...
Let me clarify that. What this is actually showing, like, this is where we have found fossils of trees with the same DNA, basically.
Sure.
So, like, at one time, like, when it was Pangea,
Yeah.
they was, like, more close together, and then it spread out, and then they all kind of went through different ways.
So cool.
You talked about old growth redwood. What's not old growth redwood?
So the general distinction is, like, old growth is anything that existed before we logged everything, and then second growth is anything that started growing since roughly like the 1850s, basically.
So is that like more sustainable?
That's an interesting topic because basically, like, we do have managed redwood forests, but they're kind of sickly. Basically, we plant them in ways that they'll grow really fast because they do grow really fast. So we like space them out a lot so they can have a lot of sunlight. And it gives you like redwood decking really quickly. but because it's not growing as slowly as it normally would, it's sort of just like this soft, spongy tree that really kind of isn't like what it was before. But what was that?
Oh, the ecosystems haven't had as much time as
Yeah.
the old growth with more intricate ecosystems associated with them than the ones that are
Yeah.
makes sense.
Question in the front.
Yeah, you differentiated between redwoods and sequoias. What's
Yeah, I didn't talk about sequoias too much in here at all, actually. They are related, but they're very different trees that have adapted for different environments, basically. Like the sequoias have basically adapted to a drier climate up in the Sierras, whereas the coast redwoods have adapted to like the really wet environment of the coast.
So when you say 95% of them logged, is that the entire species or specifically redwood?
Specifically, the coast redwoods have been logged. We didn't log the sequoias because it was too hard to get the wood down here. Basically, with the redwoods, we could basically mine all along a river, throw them in the river, down to the ocean, mill them at the ocean, and ship them down to the city or down to South America or whatever, basically. So, whereas they're like all the way up in the mountains, and they're like, it's too hard. So.
We have one here.
What grows in place of redwoods, and how do regrowth redwoods compete?
So what's happening is that Douglas fir, which is also like a really like kind of robust vital tree, which a lot of homes are built out of. This house is actually once we logged all the redwood, then we went for the Douglas fir basically. The Douglas fir is taking over basically because it can grow. So this gets super technical, but like of the redwoods that are left, they like create a lot of shadow, and the Douglas fir can tolerate that more than the redwoods can. The redwoods grow really slowly in shadows. So Douglas fir is basically taking over. That's kind of what you were talking about, like these environment. They're not going to grow back the way they used to without like serious, like hand-curated intervention, basically. So
Is this a redwood in the background?
this is a redwood, yeah.
What are you doing with the redwood you're finding in the dumpsters?
Lots of different things. We're going to use one for a deck back here, but then also I'm just finishing up a lot of it, just kind of show people like the wood and give it to people. So actually, if you haven't been under the tent over here, I've got like a little display set up with redwood, and I have a bunch of pieces I can give away of like some really old growth stuff. So basically, like I want to do something with it, but at this point, I've mostly just been kind of like loving it a little bit.
That's valid.
It's considered a conifer, right?
I believe so, yeah.
And it's got needles and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't flower.
It does not flower, no.
How do cones, like I'm just thinking about it right now, how do you cut it?
I forget the details on this. It produces a bunch of cones, but it doesn't propagate by seed.
Or
Yeah.
it can, I think.
Can it? I
It can
forget.
propagate, but it propagates by seed only if it burns.
No, that's
So
right,
if it burns, the cones explode and spread the seed. Otherwise, they don't. So that's the other thing that's made it kind of a super tree is it has these two ways of reproducing itself.
type of stuff that happens when your genome is 200 million years old.
Yeah, it's like, we can figure out a way to do it this way.
Rob, does that mean we're going to need fires in the curated redwood areas?
They do some controlled burns, yeah.
Last one?
So I'm driving down the street and I see some lumber. How do I know to hit the brakes because it's redwood? Color or what am I looking
From the car, it might be a little hard,
Okay.
but if you get out and check it out, so the table under the tent here has all that information. Yeah.
And grab him and take him under there and definitely
Take some, right?
if you like it, take home a little piece because we definitely.
Or the wood.
We can negotiate later.